Hello YouTubers out in YouTube land. It's me, your favorite Bible thumper, Minister Morris, and welcome to Morris Ministries. And today we're going to be going a little bit more about the backgrounds of Genesis as more of a physical basis, especially the second day. Now we did get into that a little bit about how time works, and that's one of the biggest issues when tackling this subject. But just as a way of review, and God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and morning were the second day." I know that's just a quick go-through about what that is, or the verses we're going to be talking about, but this is more about the science. The science about how the universe works, and the separations of the firmaments of the heavens. See, we did discuss about how the firmament is the dimensions between where we live and where heaven actually exists, and how it's all working in closed loops, and how gravitons are real, and all that kinds of stuff. This is more the fundamental basis as we see it today, and what's wrong with their current models. See, the standard model of physics deals with 4 elementary forces, and that each one is separate, but somewhat entangled upon another, or not so much entangled, but are completely related or proportional to another. Okay, the gravity, electromagnetism, the weak force, and the strong force. However, some people have theorized that the weak and strong forces really combined with electromagnetism in some way to make the electroweak forces and things like that. But as a more of a technical definition for these things, we have gravity, the general force that attracts 2 objects together. It's one of the basic Newtonian laws, and in Einstein's general theory of relativity, gravity is thought of as a wave, and this is where smallest particles of matter exist, the graviton itself radiating gravity, and it being the smallest unit of what matter is composed of. There has to be a fundamental smallest unit. Now, electromagnetism, on the other hand, is the fundamental force that deals with the interaction of charged particles, absorption of photons, and those kinds of things. So electromagnetism, that if electricity is moving, or an electron itself is moving through a medium, it will permeate a field, an electric field as well as a magnetic field. The electric field moving in the direction of the photon or the electron, and the magnetic field moving perpendicular to the actual object in motion. The weak force, however, starting with the elementary forces that have radioactive decay, such that as time moves forward, this thing is going to die, and by which rates does it die? More specifically, things like neutrinos. And the strong force, however, is the force that actually binds quarks together into clusters. And it's these 2 forces that give the idea of the particle zoo. Well, not the idea of the particle zoo, that's more by the colliders and the actual applications of theoretical physics as it exists today. But when you start looking into a quark, well, a quark is then composed of other things, and so on, and then you have your bosons and all that lovely stuff that exists in the zoo, and you go deeper and deeper until you get these ideas that, well, eventually you get so small that you end up with virtual particles. Because you can't exist outside of, or you can't exist beyond the Planck's constants. Planck's constants being the measure of energy carried by photons and its frequency, or at least the relative measure by which it's done. And you cannot go beyond that as a physical limit that exists within the universe. It exists because, as we stated before, how time works, and time is completely related to all these things. But going backwards, about virtual particles. Virtual particles are things that come in and out of existence simultaneously to allow particles that do exist to be there. It creates the means by which an electromagnetic force within the smallest particles are there. However, there's no proof of that. It's just a theory that was proposed to make sure it is that way, and we take it for fact today. It is that way, but not for that reason. You see, if you take a look on a 10-dimensional universe, what's really happening is that particles that are cycling through the medium between dimensions are creating a spill out. You know, if you were to put water, if you had a cup of water and you were to pour something in, you would see that it lashes through the medium and it creates ripples and waves on the surface. If you look at a particle circling from the 10th dimension back through the first, you would see the very same thing. You'd see, as the water pours through, the particle moving through the medium, it creates ripples and waves. And as a result, backsplashing coming up, it creates the means by which the other particles exist. It's actually its energy dissipating through the medium that allows those things to exist. And it's why everything works in closed loops. And it's why I brought up Planck's constant. See, anything that moves beyond or smaller than the Planck space eventually closes into itself and it loses locality. You know, the idea that this exists definitively within this space. Anything smaller than that does not exist within that space. It exists in all spaces, and it's why it exists that way. See, because the first dimension is the permeation of energy itself, photons, and all that kind of stuff. When you start moving upwards into the electromagnetic spectrum, you know, you move from the weak force or strong, what was it? The strong force. Yes. A strong force being the force that binds those things together. Well, this is a result of a 10th dimensional particle moving between the medium. It creates the conditions for which that is so. The weak force, however, the decay of certain things, is where that dimensional ripple is not happening. It's no different than, let's say, what is it? Constructive and destructive interference. You see, where destructive interference is happening is creating that weak force where things are going to end up decaying, and it's predictable because the rates of energy that are being propagated through the medium are happening within certain regions and are going to be happening relative to certain things. The bigger you are, the more you're going to have. The less you are, the less you're going to have. Stuff along those natures. Now, without getting into the real super math of it. So you have these forces. Those two are explainable by particles moving through the space, and electromagnetism just happens to be a second dimensionary force, and gravity being a first dimensional force. Everything is relative to everything else. You see, a graviton, being the smallest unit of matter, as it radiates gravity, gravity would then be, in essence, a first dimensional force. However, in 3 dimensions, we see it propagate much easier. This is why electromagnetism, which you can see working in the 3-dimensional plane, and gravity are proportional to each other. It's also one of the reasons why Planck's first solutions to the equations that Einstein proposed deal with imaginary numbers. It's just the way it is, because the imaginary numbers projected into a different plane, and as Einstein was already grappling with the 4th dimension, his solutions would have proposed that gravity and its effects and time, all of those things are actually relative to a 5th dimension. And as you see the 5th dimension, it's like, well, how does it work? What can you see? How do you even know it's there? Well, this is where dark matter and dark energy actually come into play, although there is a primordial energy that does exist that we'll never actually be able to see, because there'll be no collider big enough with which to see it or observe it, unless you were to actually look at cosmic ray bursts out in the solar system, and you could actually see the dark matter halos that are around particles themselves. But going backwards a little bit, so you have dark matter. Dark matter is the 5th dimensional. It is matter that is truly of a 5th dimensional origin. We are matter of 4 and down. However, humans exist within all those 10 dimensions, but that is more of a spiritual consequence of energy moving through the medium. It is not so much relative to the actual 5th dimensional plane. You can move through the plane, but only spiritually and not physically. Physically, though, what you see as dark matter is the shadow of time. The 5th dimension is where time is existing simultaneously with another. You see, in today's worldview, we have this idea of infinite numbers of dimensions when there's really near infinite panels in which time exists. See, we went through the timeline and how it works and all that stuff, and dark matter happens to be the shadow of all those things happening relative to everything else. This is why dark matter is increasing faster than anything else in the universe. And it links itself to black holes. You see, black holes not absorb anything, they're actually radiating mass outward. A fifth dimensional object is a black hole. The actual fifth dimension is dark matter. No different than in the second dimension, we can see particles, and it's moving through the third dimension that we can observe. A black hole is an object, and it is moving in and around the medium of the fourth dimension. Because we as human beings can only move through the space in which we are in, but a fifth dimensional object does not. It's almost like poking a hole through a paper. You see, you can connect two ends of the paper without ever having to draw a line, without ever having to be on the space. That is the beauty of a fifth dimensional object. It does not have to do that, and they're all completely connected to each other instantaneously. It's completely relative to the 0-point energy and 0-point spaces, or the Higgs field. However you want to see it, they're actually the same thing. And this is why the Higgs field is so closely related to dark, or I should say black holes as they are. It's because it's actually the same principle working. As a fifth dimensional object protrudes into the fourth dimension, radiating mass outward, you are seeing photons going through a second dimensional medium, gaining matter and mass. It's actually the same principle working in two different dimensions because it's completely related to each other. Eventually, they're going to end up proving all these kinds of things. And it's why time only works as a sphere relative to itself. You see, because if you were to look at a dark matter, if you were to look at a black hole, you would see the void center, and as it protrudes gravitons outward, it's actually creating instances of time, because as we discussed, as gravitons rub against one another, gravity is rubbing against one another, its friction causes time. So in each instantaneous creation of gravitons, you see an instance of time being created. And if you were to work backward from the actual curvature of the universe, you can actually see exactly how old the Earth is. Now, with these ideas, you can actually create a true unified principle of how everything works. It only works in the fifth dimensional mathematics. And you can raise it up to the 10th being the fundamental limit. But as soon as you figure out the mathematics of the fifth dimension, you'll know how everything else works. The idea that there are such things as negative zeros and negatives infinities, and they're completely interchangeable and related to one another, because it wouldn't work otherwise. Having the idea of a negative zero is the means by which you can start propagating through the medium. You see, you can actually warp or create your own instance of a 0-point energy. We do it today when we superglue particles. You can also do this by resonating a field that creates an open space around an object in between, almost creating not a wormhole per se, but just for the sake of argument, you can actually create a small tunnel where you're moving space around an object instead of moving through the medium. You're actually taking the principle of the 0-point space, 0-point energy, and the fifth dimension working across itself. So it connects 2 points in space instantaneously because you are not moving through the medium. The medium is moving around you. And that is the engineering, let's say, of how a negative zero and a negative infinity are interchangeable, because it lets you perceive a certain event based on what you're already looking at. If you're looking into the future, you have the present, which is the zero, and you're looking outward to an infinite event. But also, since you're at the present looking at it at negative zero, you can look backwards infinitely or forwards infinitely, depending on what it is that you specifically are orienting around the system. And that is where most of the sciences are having a lot of trouble. You see, the idea of the Standard Model actually restricts them, whereas having the idea of string theory more confined and relating these things, because each medium works on itself because the laws are always equal to one another, depending on what the object is and how much energy, all the laws are the same. You see, the difference between Newtonian physics is the scale and dimension in which you're working them in, but the principles are always the same. See, Newtonian physics works strictly within a 3-dimensional space. If you move it into time, that's why it breaks down. But if you were to take a fourth dimensional mechanics and move them down into the third dimension, it works perfectly well. See, because a third dimensional mathematics works as approximations of what fourth dimensional mathematics shows. So if you were to take fifth dimensional mathematics and start working it down, you'd end up getting the same things and having approximations there, because you start working in probability schemes, more so probability schemes than anything else. I mean, this is the idea that everything is made up of mediums of energy, and as we talked before about the Holy Spirit and how all that stuff works. Okay. So even though everything is empty space, and everything has a spirit moving through the medium, so the idea becomes is, well, if everything has a spirit, and you have a spirit, what is the difference between you and them, and how does that make up? Well, it's because you are actually your soul, that part of God that God gave to you, the things that the angels themselves don't, is what connects you to heaven itself, beyond the boundaries that exist. And as you move forward through the medium being space as we exist today, okay, gravitons are combining and eliminating with itself, moving you through. You are connected to them, and you are a part of them. It is your will that makes them move with you, because your will is greater than theirs. Now, this is only working in a contextual frame to let you have the idea that as you're moving through the space, gravitons are actually moving across you, and you're producing a field. And that field is first, second, third dimensional, because gravity works in a fifth dimensional way. No different than electromagnetism, because they're interchangeable and proportional to one another. So you're creating a field that is moving these other necessary objects and particles closer into you and away from you. And as you're creating time, the actual universe expanding and accelerating is because there's more time, because there's more objects in existence to permit that time happening. Okay, so as you move through, and that's pretty much the essence of how the universe really works. It goes into a couple other things, kind of like, let's say, why witchcraft can work, and how you can move an object. Like, for instance, the idea of being able to bend an object to your will, moving something closer, you do telekinesis and all that stuff. Well, it's very true. You can project yourself, astral projection, lets you work in a fifth dimensional plane, and you're orienting energy close to your, moving your will, and trying to bend an object to your will. In other words, making it a part of yourself and moving it through the medium as you would move yourself. It's what permits that to happen. And as for witchcraft, well, it works on a different scale. Instead of you becoming the object, okay, you are forcing something else to bend the object's will. And it's what lets all that goody-goody stuff happen. But any questions, comments, and concerns, leave it down in the description below, and thank you for tuning in.